Hello, I'm Craig Watkins, the Good Systems Research Director for Racial Justice at the University of Texas at Austin. Good Systems is a University of Texas grand challenge that focuses on ethical artificial intelligence. As we know, artificial intelligence is becoming more ubiquitous, creeping into our lives in many different ways, including the lives of children. Today, we have assembled a panel that is going to explore some of the emergent and critical issues related to kids and their relationship to artificial intelligence. Some of the issues that we intend to address, we'll look at questions of race and ethnicity, diversity and inclusion as it relates to AI and design, also thinking about education and AI literacy, and how do we help young children develop the skills to navigate the technology world in which they find themselves living. And then we'll also think about some of the policy implications and how we might be able to create, from a policy perspective, a fairer and more equitable relationship to the technology world that we all find ourselves in. We've got a great panel assembled here today, researchers and educators, practitioners in the technology space. And before we get started, I'd like for each of them to introduce themselves, first starting with Jacky, and then Reid, and then Sharon.
Oh, great. Thanks, Craig. Hi, I'm Jacky Bailey. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the School of Information. And what I research is thinking about interactive and immersive technologies such as virtual reality, digital assistants, and what that means across the lifespan. My current work is looking at kids' experiences of virtual characters and virtual reality, how youth evaluate, think about, and use digital assistants such as Siri or Alexa, and how we can think about virtual reality, making social connections in informal and formal learning environments. And I look forward to our discussion today. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. We've got a lot of great perspectives.
Reid.
All right. Hey, my name is Reid Koch. I've been a data scientist for the last 10 years, and my specialty is natural language processing, which is all the AI that deals with like written, spoken, and signed human languages. That's everything from Google Translate to Amazon Alexa, also pieces of Google Search. Right now, I'm a senior machine learning engineer at Kung Fu AI, which is an AI consultancy in Austin, and that's where I had the good fortune to run into Good Systems. But I've also spent the last 6 years teaching Python and artificial intelligence in various school and university settings. I'm really excited to be here and bring all these observations from my time teaching at Hello World Tech Studio, where I developed and taught a Python curriculum for 3rd through 12th graders that took them all the way from writing their first line of code to making a deep neural network that made watercolors and novel songs. So thrilled to be here.
Thank you.
And I'm Sharon Sprouse. I'm a professor in the Moody College of Communication in the School of Journalism and Media. I have always been interested in what are considered new technologies. Of course, what that has meant recently is all things online, including social media, the Internet of Toys, and the variety of circulation systems that artificial intelligence is one critical component of. I think my work in the artificial intelligence domain, has focused a lot on how people use artificial intelligence from a corporate standpoint in order to deliver certain information, as well as how we as users, as citizens, and as consumers encounter those systems and how we feel we can or cannot control them.
Thank you. And I'll just quickly say that as a faculty here at the University of Texas, I've studied over the years looking at technology, digital media, systems like AI, primarily through a racial equity lens, and continue to do that work and working as part of the research project that Jacky is leading, looking at how African American and Latinx youth evaluate and interact with these systems. So we're looking forward to talking about that, as well as a variety of other things today. So we'll get started. Jacky, we'll go to you first, but the idea is that this will just be very conversational. And Jacky, we're looking forward to you getting us started. So I mentioned, and you've mentioned the Good Systems research, funded research project that you're working on, which looks at the ways in which African American and Latinx youth interact with artificial intelligent devices like digital assistants. I know that from the perspective of the team that you put together, that you were very interested in looking at this through kind of the framework of research that hasn't really sort of fully addressed how kids from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds, their engagement with these systems. I'm wondering if you could maybe share a little bit about what the team is learning and any insights that you have from this study that you've been doing with Good Systems.
Yes, it's been a great project. I've really enjoyed it so far. And I think it's just a really great way to start this panel as well, because it talks about this broader issue of what good systems means and how we can think about that broadly across society. And the main goal is, how do we get these different perspectives, different ages, for example, who are going to be using these systems much more in the future, and how can we really think about how they're represented and how they can serve populations across the board. And for our project, we've had some adolescents, African American, Latinx children participate in a study, and it's been really interesting through this process. The population that we focused on are more of our tech savvy, our experts in digital assistants. These are kids who've used it typically on their phones, such as Siri. They might have home devices as well. And we've learned a lot through this project in terms of thinking about, do kids wonder about their own identity? Do they wonder about how these machines work? What do they do? And one thing that came out, which was interesting, I think this probably happens with every generation, but these kids had a sophisticated sense of understanding what these systems are, and they had an understanding that on some level there was somebody behind making these machines, and that they have a particular intention. And I think that's really important, particularly as we see AI move to phones, where a lot of these kids have access to it. However, there's still some discrepancy about what does that really mean? Who are making these devices? Where is this information coming from? But our group was really tech savvy and understanding that there's somebody else making these systems. One student even, reflected on his family, his community in Mexico, talking about how this wasn't really a product that he would really see in Mexico and they wouldn't really use very often. But in America, it made a lot of sense to do that. They've also had some really exciting ideas about what can we think about these products in the future as well. And they see this as something that could be an assistant, but they saw a lot of pitfalls where they're trying to seek more nuanced information, more meaningful information, but getting a lot of these direct kind of simple answers. So they'll use other technologies. So right now, they're not necessarily seeing this as a creative way to express themselves, which I think is speaking to the fact that these systems aren't really engaging the way children want to engage, where it's not just factual information, but they want meaning and in-depth understanding of how things work in the world.
I have a question, Jacky.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when the psychologist Sherry Turkle did some of her very early research on children engaging with computers. There was this question, and computers embedded in toys and things that kids could easily interact with. And one question that kind of hovered around her research was the issue of the extent to which kids were able to determine whether the toys, whether these embodied presences were real, were human, could feel pain, for example, which kind of gets at the humanity question in a lot of these experiences. I was wondering if your research has reflected on that at all, or if it backs into it.
Yes, that's a question I'm very fascinated about and very interested in, and seeing how kids particularly start imagining these devices, these things in their life, in the world. And for the future of AI particularly, we're going to see it for children, we're going to see it, as you're saying, toys. robots. There are a lot more smart toys than we ever seen before, where they can engage with children. And I think through toys, in some ways, people don't necessarily think about it as artificial intelligence as a social peer. But this is the work that I'm interested in as well, in terms of, for example, VR, how kids are viewing these things, how are they thinking about Siri or Alexa as these types of devices. I think it's an interesting question. There's research out there, particularly with robotics, showing that kids will have moral reasoning when they engage with robots. So they'll think about robots as potentially having minds, but not minds like a person or an animal. So they'll have these new categories of these devices, and they do actually put some level of moral understanding about how you would treat a robot, more of an anthropomorphized robot. And so there's a lot of areas, I think, where there's a lot of interest where we could see, what does that mean if they start thinking about these devices this way? What if they don't and they practice what we would consider amoral behaviors? Is that okay? Is it not okay? There's articles about parents saying, should my children be polite to these devices? Because I want my child to practice being polite. It's important to me.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Sharon, and something that as I was reading through some of the transcripts and the team wrote a paper about some of this research, there were at least a couple of instances that come to mind where a young person may have referred to a Siri or an Alexa as a friend, and I know that one of the many concerns that adult society has expressed about kids and their relationship to technology is the degree to which they develop this sense of connection and intimacy with them. And to what degree, right, does that become problematic insofar as they begin to express faith and belief and connections to machines rather than people? And so I think it raises some really provocative questions. My interest in this project, with a lot of reasons, sort of inspired my interest in this project. But prior research, has suggested to me that what Black and Latinx children bring to these technologies, in all likelihood, are going to be very different than what their white counterparts bring to these technologies in terms of experience, lived experience, in terms of interest, motivation, aspirations. And a lot of the literature suggests that, at least up to this point, these systems haven't necessarily been designed with that kind of diverse and inclusive population in mind. And so, to what extent, right, can kids connect to a device that in some way, doesn't really recognize or identify them in ways that may be culturally meaningful or relevant? And so I think it just introduces some really interesting complex dimensions to how we think about how kids are constructing these technologies and how they're facilitating their relationship to these technologies as they begin to sort of navigate some of these cultural and social kinds of disconnections, if you will.
Yes, exactly. I think that's also important in terms of how they view these devices. Are they truly the source of knowledge? Are they truly the source of social influence? And if these devices and the AI that's powering these devices aren't really built thinking about building meaningful relationships across different types of communities, or presenting information in a way that could unintentionally be harmful because there just hasn't had, the voices aren't represented in the people making these. And so I think another nice thing about this project is, by engaging children and youth and talking about these topics, they then can engage with their parents and talk more about these things and think more about their community and how they might be represented. And who knows, maybe they'll start working for one of these big tech companies in the future and make these better devices.
Just to, echo a point that Jacky made, I was really struck. I don't think I was necessarily expecting this. Maybe others on the team were, but I was really struck by how the sort of sophisticated language and framework that these kids were using. So their ability to talk about design, intent, someone behind the machine, recognizing that there are commercial kinds of incentives, that are implicated in the development of these technologies, and the fact that kids were able to articulate that, to me, was just pretty impressive, actually.
If there's time, I actually also have another question for you, Jacky. So I think it's apparent to most people that there are a lot of shortcomings in terms of how systems like these are able to operate in kind of a more nuanced and maybe culturally appropriate way with people from different backgrounds. But it's also becoming increasingly clear that just at surface level functionality, they don't really do as well for all people in all tasks. And I'm very curious about to what extent this is coming up in your project, and especially how it intersects with kind of this question of identity and representation in the minds of these kids.
Yes, I think this maybe also is another hat tip to Sherry Turkle's work earlier, is that, and also Craig's work, is that these kids are finding out ways to get around these systems when they don't provide them what they need. They'll use it as sometimes a support for what they're trying, if they're trying to search for the meaning of a song or trying to find something else about themselves. It was interesting to hear kids say, oh, I would look in a book first, for example. A child said that, and then maybe use a digital assistant. And it wasn't necessarily because they didn't find that it was easy to use an assistant. In some cases, they say, oh, it's a lot easier than typing in a search engine. I can just speak it. But they found that they just weren't getting the type of answers that they wanted, or they understood that the answer that they were getting might have been based on a previous question. So, for example, during the project, one of the interviews, we would have the kids do interact with the device. And so, they asked Siri, what's your favorite movie? And it was a Star Wars movie. But then the child was smart enough to say, I think it's because I asked about stormtroopers earlier. So I don't really know if that's really the real answer. And so I think they're understanding that there are limitations, and they're eager to use other things to connect with that. And so I think they are very sophisticated in understanding it, but they're just not satisfied as something that they would trust the answers to or to lean on. I remember this is one that I just laugh about every time, is a child was asking, trying to ask the system some questions, and it just gave this really strange answer. And then they're like, I don't know, she doesn't know, nobody knows. They were just so frustrated. And I was like, I know that you just have that feeling of exasperation. So it's been interesting to see how they've been navigating those spaces, which could be something that they do on a regular basis as they try to navigate themselves in a community, in a system, in a world where they have to find resources to kind of get the answers that they want.
Reid, I'd like to turn to you for a moment here. We're all educators here, in some form or fashion, and of course, for the last 15 to 20 years or so, there's just been this growing push for STEM education, STEM literacy. There's a lot of the work that many of the panelists here have done has been related to digital literacy. We're thinking more and more today about data literacy, AI literacy. I know that this is a space, Reid, that you've been involved in, particularly with younger children, middle school, high school, in terms of introducing them to basic concepts and skills that allow them to not only be, consumers of these systems and technologies, but actually designers and producers of these systems as well. Before we turn it over to you, Reid, there's a video that you prepared that might serve as a nice sort of segue into this part of our panel. So at this time, we'll take a couple of minutes to watch that video.
Welcome to the first lesson of Level 1 of the Python and AI curriculum. In this video, you'll be introduced to some of the differences between AIs, as well as the two big reasons we think everyone should know a little about artificial intelligence. AI is everywhere, in TV and movies, in products people use every day like Google Search, Amazon Shopping, or Netflix, and in assistants like Alexa and Siri. However, there's a wide variety of ways that people program AI brains to tick. Some AIs are very simple and do the same thing every time. In the extreme case, a human programmer can sit down and make a list of rules. If this is what you see, this is what you should do. Other AIs can be extremely complex, almost human-like. They can have incredibly complicated algorithms for making decisions based on what they see. AIs in our world right now are increasingly learning their decision-making rules using a process called machine learning. Most often, a machine learning-based AI is given examples of a situation and what to do, and then discovers a math problem whose solution most closely mimics the examples they were given. This is great because the AI can then take any future situation, turn it into that math problem, and solve it in order to know what to do. Whether you use machine learning or not, if you're not careful as a programmer, there can be unintended consequences in real life when you apply your AI. Imagine you have a maze-solving AI. It knows it wants to take the shortest path to the X, and it knows not to bump into walls. You do an excellent job building the AI in the mazes that you had, and then you give it to someone else who wants to show it off to their friends. So they make a nice garden with all these flowers, and they make a maze with the flowers. What do you think is going to happen? Well, you design the robot to avoid walls and move towards the X, and flowers look nothing like the walls that you used to build the robot. So it does what it learned to do: avoid walls and move towards the X. Achieve its goal using everything it learned. I promise you 2 reasons to be excited about this course. The first one isn't surprising. You'll learn how to make an AI and avoid the flowers. The second, though, is more important because it will help you even if you never program again after this course. When you use Netflix, Alexa, YouTube, or anything else powered by an AI, you are the garden. These products see your activity and they have goals to pursue. They might have well-meaning goals, like recommend something you'll like, or answer your question. But a different product could have a more selfish goal, like get you to watch as many ads as possible. By learning how different AI work, you'll have an easier time seeing when a machine might be pursuing its goals at the expense of your flowers.
Reid, would you like to just elaborate on some of the work that you've been doing in the education space as it relates to AI literacy?
Definitely. So everything I'm bringing to bear here today is from my time working at Hello World Tech Studio, a company that teaches primarily after-school programs in primarily the Austin area, although I have actually gotten to go out to California and we've done some other programs in other parts of the country. It's also important to note I don't work there anymore. So this is, as it was during the time when I was there. I definitely don't mean to represent anything falsely at this point. But I had the very exciting challenge of trying to make a Python and AI curriculum for kids assuming zero knowledge. And we went through lots and lots of iterations on the curriculum, but ultimately it settled on kind of one thing, which is that the students I had responded most positively when they knew that they were doing the real adult thing, even if it was turned towards their interests. They wanted to, use a real programming language. For the most part, they weren't very interested in kind of drag and drop coding approaches. They wanted to start from a blank file. People tended to respond pretty negatively when we had a bunch of kind of starter code and it was more of a fill in the blanks type exercise. They wanted to prove to themselves that they had mastered it and that they owned this stuff. And it's very interesting because what would almost happen for almost every single lesson, what ended up happening was that a student would start by saying, this is so hard, this is impossible. And then by the end, every single time they go, actually, it was pretty easy. It wasn't that complicated, really. And that generally leads into them interacting with these real AI systems and coming up with this kind of, oh, is that all that it does? Is that all that's going on in its mind? Well, I understand that. I get what it's doing. And that's always kind of the goal that I was striving for.
I know, Jacky, you and Sharon have done work in this space. If it's kids and education and tech literacy, they're obviously at a lot of equity issues in terms of access to opportunities to learn and develop STEM skills. Just wondering if you have any thoughts or reflections on what's happening, in the education and tech space, particularly as it relates to AI, fields like data science, and what do you see as some of the challenges and opportunities? Kind of adding on to what Reid has shared with us.
Yeah, I think what both Reid and Jacky have shared so far suggests is really very encouraging, and that is that kids are enthusiastic about these technologies. They want to learn and they interrogate. the code behind them. What I think is also something we all need to continue to cultivate in the realm of digital literacy is an increased sense of ownership and control too. And that's almost another step in a way, because these systems are often truly beyond our control in terms of the systems that arrive on our doorstep, or the presents that are gift wrapped for us for birthdays or something like that. You open it up and here it is, and it's fully formed, and you can work to understand it. But how can you really ultimately then control it? Jacky had some really encouraging comments about people wanting to go into design maybe, and thinking about ways to really reformat and take control. I find that amazingly, I find it very heartening.
Yes, I think there's a lot going on that especially in that video, that ties into this conversation, that I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed that last piece about the garden and the flowers. And I think that's the big part that we need to work on now. I think as new technology comes, younger, populations, new generations, they're going to know how those things work. They're going to be like, boom, 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 I know what this is. But that one little piece about the garden and the flowers, I think that is the big piece that we need to push forward even more with education. And it's so great to see that. The idea that, the first step, I think, was understanding that these are not objective tools, that somehow they just know and they're just completely objective beyond that. But knowing that a person made those decisions, the person said, this is a wall, this is not a wall, and what it wants the system to do. And I think the next part is thinking about the humanity of the people using these devices as real people that can be affected by the choices that the designers make. Whether we know exactly what those choices are, just being aware that we cannot be passive users of these. And then also just, I hope more and more that it becomes part of the language. And I think the equity piece is getting to that point where, regardless of your background, you could see yourself potentially doing these things. Even if you say you hate it and you don't want to do it, at least having the opportunity to engage and to build, and content creation is just a really exciting area. And if we can make content creation in the AI realm equitable, where these voices and these systems and the things that people create are used in a way that's helpful. I know with other media products, there, might be videos or content that marginalized groups make, but those platforms themselves don't represent them well or target them in unfair ways. So I think we're growing in this education space. I love that there's the flower garden analogy, and I think the more kids can think about that, the better.
I think you used a really important word, Jacky, this word humanity. And I know in the electronic game space more generally, and I think this applies entirely to the involvement of AI in various sets of games, a lot of complaints are raised that the environment of these games objectifies things too much. They give kids a license to behave badly in a way. And of course, the complaint around video games and much earlier technology has classically been that it encourages people to treat other people as automatons, as targets, as lacking humanity. Are there some ways that we should be engaging in this very creative building space that can really cultivate humanity or human values?
So I actually had a very funny interaction with a student not so long ago. I did like a one-off Saturday, do some cool AI stuff type workshop. And I taught them how to make sort of a simple rule-based chatbot. And then we did a little kind of presentation at the end where everyone showed off the conversations that they had programmed in. And one of them came up with something that, of course, never in a million years would have occurred to me. They built a robot, a chatbot, that they could annoy so that they could be annoying but not annoy other people. So that's not a direct answer to your question, but I just would have never imagined something like that.
Reid, something else that you said was interesting, if I recall correctly. You mentioned that, the educational activities that you were involved in were taking place in like after school settings. And it sort of speaks to something that I know many of us have seen in our own research, and some work that I did a few years ago that was supported by the MacArthur Foundation, where we were actually going into schools and looking at the ways in which the proliferation of technology in schools, to what extent, right, is it creating or opening up opportunities for young people to develop, right, the kinds of skills and competencies that are increasingly important in our knowledge-driven economy. And what we found, right, is consistent with what many other researchers have found, is that our schools have become, technology rich, but they still remain, curriculum poor. And so the opportunities, particularly for kids coming from lower income households, Latinx, African American, immigrant youth, for example, they had these really interesting, and we write about this in a book that we titled The Digital Edge, how Black and Latino youth navigate digital inequality. But they have these incredible interests and aspirations, right, to sort of find their way within the sort of digital media world as producers of content, as creators, as storytellers, as kind of makers of their own media environment. And yet so much of what they were able to do in terms of pursuing that was likely taking place in the after school setting, in sort of summer enrichment activities, as opposed to the actual formal school curriculum itself, which really didn't create the kind of robust pathways that allowed them to develop those kinds of skills that they were interested in developing. And so it's just an interesting, kind of revealing story about the challenges that we still face in terms of making sure that access to high quality STEM education is accessible to all youth, and not just some. And so this is something that I think is certainly going to continue to be an issue, because we start thinking about issues around data literacy, AI literacy, what it means to live in a datafied world, and the importance of helping young people develop the skills and the competencies to navigate these worlds in a much more effective and efficient way.
So I had, I think, almost that exact sentiment shared with me, but by maybe a 15-year-old at some point. And I would really love to very quickly slide that in here. So at the end of a week-long program, I had students reflect, kind of as a group, we were reflecting on, what was this like for you? How did this, what did this change about your self-perception, all of this kind of stuff, career paths that you imagine. And one of them said, well, I'd never coded before, so I didn't know what it was, but actually it was very different from my expectations, and now I'm interested in it. And the next person said, I'd done this thing before, but the curriculum wasn't very good, and so I'd kind of written it off, but now I'm kind of interested. And then the person who had just spoken said, oh yeah, I did that too. And it's to the point where, from what I've seen, if kids don't feel like they got mastery out of the program in their head, they just didn't do the program at all, or didn't do a real program in that respect. And this dovetails very poorly with the issue that when resources are short, the easiest way to teach a class is to water down the associated curriculum, especially in this world of AI, where at some point you just need a laptop that can do certain things to have a certain kind of AI lesson, and just cloud-based solutions and stuff, but it all costs money at some point. So yes, just a really big yes.
Sharon, I'd like to pivot to you for a moment here. I know you have a lot of expertise, a lot of your research is focused on, media communication technologies and policy. There is a growing, kind of, concern, even anxiety around kids' relationship to these systems. People concerned about, for example, the ECHO, and to what extent it's collecting data or insights or information about kids that most parents are simply not aware of. And I know that that the Federal Trade Commission has received complaints about this. What do you think in terms of what are some policy prescriptions or ideas or that might help support us being able to create an environment in which kids' development, their safety, their privacy is both respected and protected?
I would say right now we're stalled on policy in the United States. In particular, the European Union has maybe been a little bit more on top of policy around some of these technologies than the United States has. In that's not a very big surprise, though. Our communication policy has typically been several steps behind the actual creation, sale, and proliferation and popularity of communication technologies. So policy tends to be pretty reactive. In general, it just doesn't get out in front of the problems. And as the pace of technology hastens, as products roll out faster, as capabilities multiply, I think that becomes a real problem. When the panel was talking about how to approach some of these issues in an earlier session, we brought up the one kind of law that does apply to children and technology in this space. And it's the acronym for it is COPPA. It's the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. Well, when was that passed? 1998. That's the last major legislation in this space, 1998. And the concern there was online advertising, targeting children. At that time, I happened to do a little inventory of some of that advertising, and I talked to parents too, and it was evident there was this huge slippage between these extraordinarily appealing online spaces where their kids wanted to be, wanted to go, and what the parents both knew about the spaces and what they felt they could really do about them. We're experiencing the same thing right now with this whole garden variety of technologies, of toys. Really, Reid brought up the chat bot. Bots are, I think, the next horizon as bot technology evolves, as everything becomes cheaper. There'll be more and more bots of different flavors entering our kids' lives and our lives, adult lives as well. And in as much as they have this, even greater social presence than, say, a Siri would or than an Alexa was, there's a whole range of relationship and social issues that parents in particular, will start wondering about and will start worrying about. What's in the realm of possibility? Federal regulations? Well, in the United States, the companies behind a lot of these devices are so large and so powerful that they have often tended to control the agendas of the regulatory agencies. I think this is probably a really good moment for people, especially when people understand how these technologies operate. And I'm, again, to the point of why it's so encouraging to hear that kids understand something of the way they're being manipulated. It might it might be the case that the access has to move toward parents really actively leaning on regulatory agencies and on the companies themselves in order to ensure that there are more protections and more knowledge as well about how the devices are actually behaving. Craig brought up the issue of privacy protections. There's ongoing debate about how much data these devices are gathering from kids' interactions, from adult interactions as well. Geolocational data is one element of that, along with facial recognition, voice recognition, and behavioral patterns. Let's not forget these devices have memories or pseudo-memories built into them, so that when it comes to interacting with kids in particular, that stormtrooper anecdote is perfect. Devices remember, at least kids realize the devices remember. to what extent, without going into a kind of Black Mirror scenario, to what extent does memory and behavioral conditioning and behavioral responsiveness to what a device or a system, or as some people call it, an assemblage, that understands exactly how you or how your child would respond to this device. To what extent should that be allowed? Even to what extent do we want programmed play and those sorts of play experiences? I mean, is the Internet of Toys, which actually is a thing, you can actually find that in the literature, connected toys, does that destroy play? Does it enhance play? Will the play that results from the connected experiences, should we evaluate that as authentic play?
Yeah.
Is there something lesser about it? I don't know. A lot of psychology.
Reid or Jacky, any thoughts or reactions to?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Two things come to mind about what you talked about there, Sharon. One is the issue of surveillance, particularly for marginalized communities. And, whoever decides that if I hear this phrase used, or if I hear you're looking at this item or something, just as on a basic level, that could be an issue that, someone who is not informed, someone who doesn't have the understanding of different communities might see that as a threat, or, who's getting access to this information? How do we know when we're being surveilled? And so there's a long history of that for marginalized communities such as the Black community, about being monitored and the choices that are made off of that information. And particularly for kids, I think that's really important to understand the rules and the laws around those different things as well.
There's been a lot of clamoring about how opaque the algorithms are that are behind a lot of these devices, and that becomes a real kind of regulatory edge as well. Should those algorithms be open to us, or should some trusted third party be in charge of the databases that accumulate behind those algorithms? Those are some of the ideas that are actually being kicked around right now. Have trusted third parties be the sites where, say, children's data produced by interacting with some AI propelled device.
And that's where you get into, right, some of these ethical questions.
Yeah.
These are debates that are ramping up, and it is quite fascinating, right, to see where we've come just in the last 5 to 10 years as it relates to this. And obviously, right, the tech sector is going to push back, mightily against, having to reveal, what's going on with the algorithms, quote unquote, letting us inside the black box, so to speak. But there are issues around, transparency. How do we deal with fairness? How do we deal with equity? How do we deal with some of these disparate, outcomes that are oftentimes associated with these algorithmic processes, particularly right when they come to, the health and wellness of children. And so I suspect, right, that this is going to be, one facet of a much more, complicated conversation, civic conversation, political conversation. But all of this suggests, right, that the stakes are becoming increasingly high, and it'll be interesting to see kind of the shifts and directions that we take, and how advocacy for children and children's rights become more and more a part of this debate.
Yeah,
I think the bots example is a great example that you brought up there, because I hear that being more and more of an issue of creating these artificial environments and situations and perceptions of even adults. You can make yourself an influencer by hiring bots to have you have more followers and more likes, but are you really famous? But then people see that more people like you. You can, passing along information that's incorrect, inaccurate, harmful. And it's like not understanding that difference. It's challenging for adults to distinguish in those types of environments the difference between a bot, a person, and and really finding meaning in that. And then, children, adolescents, social exclusion feels very painful during that age. Younger kids, thinking of it as an authority figure, or something that knows that they can trust. And hopefully, with this education that Reid is doing, they will understand more about what's behind a bot. But it's hard. It's hard to understand what those are.
Well, and if they're designed well, they become so attractive. And let's face it, even if you know it's a bot, if you're getting some gratifications out of it, if it's working for you, then life is good, right? I think that's there's a sort of paradox involved in this, and you don't have to look too far to see that people are using care bots and in a variety of domains. A lot of in Japan, as I understand it, there's a growing industry of bots caring for older people because that population is getting older and they need companionship. And to the extent that bots can fulfill that, and as they get better and better with running with better AI, that's providing a service. It's a social service.
I have a question for the panel, and anyone feel free to jump in. I suspect that there may be, developers, people in the tech sector who may be watching this or curious about what we have to say. What would you suggest, recommend, or note to them in terms of how you wish they might approach how they design these systems, particularly for young children?
So I was thinking about this earlier. The title of our talk is Insights for Designers, and I realized all of my stuff was just about a class that I used to teach. So I tried to come up with some things that might actually be helpful for people who weren't me a year ago. And some of the big things were, I actually completely agree. I think it was Sharon, you were saying about, kids seeing these things as authority figures. And that's something that I see all the time. And that's something that I generally see less and less the deeper they go into the class. And I see this shifting of perception from, maybe one day I could make other cool AI that do neat futuristic things like this thing. And it shifts to, maybe one day I could join the team that works on this and improve it because it doesn't quite work in these ways because it's kind of dumb. But the thing that always, the aspect of the curriculum that always feels so integral to that is really highlighting the mechanisms behind AI decisions. And there's nothing to say that an AI experience that is a little more forthcoming about what it was taking into account when it made its decision or judgment or recommendation. I think, speaking very biased as someone who grew up, was once a kid and now loves AI and makes AI and stuff, I would have loved that as a kid. I would have been all in on that and would have happily dug deeper and deeper to try to see what was going on and been able to make some more informed decisions that way. The other quick thing that I wanted to share is the totally not surprising, but somehow always surprising realization that kids are terrible at typing. But more importantly, this is obviously just an issue of exposure. And then when unequal access to resources come into play, a lot of very obvious consequences fold out from there very, very quickly. But it's not just typing. It's not just that certain schools, everyone has a MacBook and they're super fast at typing. Other schools, there's 2 tablets and we huddle around it. It's technological literacy as a whole, right? It's not just the physical skills. They don't happen automatically. And certainly as someone who designs AI, it's tempting to forget that. It makes the process a lot easier if you forget that. So I guess don't forget that.
Thanks, Reid. I have two suggestions. One for designers and programmers: take a long, hard look at the databases that you're using to power these systems. particularly, for example, thinking about voice-driven systems. What are you using for the speech? Where are you getting your content from? What is the text, the words that you're developing and you're curating for these systems? And the best way is to get actual kids, actual families, and not just the ones that are conveniently located within, a few blocks from your office or just in that city. Really thinking about going back to that humanity point, humans are a spectrum of experiences, needs. And I think it'll be very revealing in the types of how kids ask questions and the types of questions that they ask. And that was revealed in the project I spoke about earlier, about how they would ask, what was the meaning of this song? Why did this artist write this song? And the system's like, I can't answer that question. So I think by bringing actual kids and families in, they'll see the types of questions that people actually want to know and hear about. I think that's going to be a really big part. And the second part that ties into that is really figuring out infrastructure for community engagement and feedback. So, you do it once, but you need to hear back from that community about what works, what doesn't work. And part of that can, if you're doing beta versions of something, sending a system out and having families opt into when and what they want recorded, opt in to say, giving direct feedback to that system potentially. So, these systems are going to be learning from what they hear and what they gather, but making that a little bit more upfront, making it more something that people can feel part of versus they are the thing that is being used or the product themselves.
I love those ideas. And it kind of captures what I understand is one of the two poles of approaches to some of these games. What Jacky's talking about is let's expand the verisimilitude here. Let's make these devices really capture, reproduce, and engage the wide variety of communities of people who are kids who are in our world. The opposite is the approach that says, let's make these devices less human-like. Let's make them a little flatter so that nobody ever mistakes the fact that these are apparatuses, that these are machines, fundamentally, so that we're not sucked in as craftily as sometimes we are. I don't know. One day I'm in one camp, one day I'm in the next camp. And then my other idea on this that doesn't really pertain as much to designers as to the broader system is simply, let's make these data sets open somehow. Let's make the data on which machines like this are programmed, that we're using for machine learning processes. Let's just share. Let's just see what's there. Let's allow everybody a peek under the hood, because so many of those data sets, they're off, they're walled off. We don't know what's in them. And that is something the industry could address.
One final quick note, been doing some work recently with the National Endowment for the Arts, and they've got a paper, and I've got an essay affiliated with that paper coming out around the arts and digital artists. And in this work, we talk a lot not only about STEM, but about STEAM, right? And bringing in different kinds of sensibilities, different kinds of expertise and perspectives. So what I would suggest, right, to developers and designers, right, is just to diversify your rooms, right? Diversify your teams in terms of, what kinds of expertise, what kinds of ideas are sort of informing the design of these projects, sort of broadening how you see these projects. To Jacky's point, to B's point, Sharon, to your point, I think that becomes really important. Our time is wrapping up. In fact, we're done. And I want to say thank you, Jacky, thank you, Sharon, thank you, Reid, for a very stimulating conversation. And thank you all who have joined in and listened. And we look forward to having the opportunity to engage you in additional forums.